particularly for inviting me here because I'm not a sociologist. I work in a politics department, but actually my background is more in, I came from a French department, restructuring moved me sideways. I've moved about 3 times. So I kind of feel I've got a very multidisciplinary background, but I don't kind of fit in anywhere. So I'm always interested in what other people are doing. And I'm really hoping that sociology will help me with some of my methodological problems, and I'm comforted to hear that Eleanor also has issues about what you do with masses of qualitative stuff. How do you kind of process that? So I'm interested in how politics works across borders, really, because I've been in languages and trying to understand what makes people think in different ways. So I've done some work on European citizenship as participation. So I looked at participation of European citizens in France and in the UK. And I've also more recently kind of moved a bit into the whole field of external voting as a different way of looking at how people react, so homeland politics in relation to the country that they're living in. So all that's kind of my kind of ongoing research agenda, and then Brexit came along and kind of disrupted my programme, as I'm sure was the case for many other people. So what I'm going to talk about today kind of is very much research in progress. It's an evolving subject. The last couple of days we've had some quite interesting developments in what I'm doing. So what I'm going to talk about, and my title is British Citizens or European Citizens, Rethinking Citizenship in Post-Brexit, I should have said, amongst Britons living in the EU. So I'm looking at British in the EU, Eleanor was looking at Europeans in the UK. Just a few things to say first of all is that obviously this is an incredibly topical subject, and I think I'm quite impressed and surprised by the extent to which the fate of European citizens has actually become quite a priority for not only the UK government, at least in what it's saying, and for the European negotiators themselves. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, but David Davis said on the Radio 4 yesterday morning when he was, I don't know if anyone heard him, he said we have a moral obligation towards these citizens, which is quite an achievement for him to actually be saying that, and that they're going to prioritise looking after the fate of these citizens, be they European citizens in the UK or British citizens in Europe. One of the other things that I've been taken, well, perhaps I'm not a great social media person, I'm a bit of a dinosaur, and I'm a bit terrified of all the stuff that's out there, and I don't want to spend my life looking at my phone like all my students do. You miss the world around you, but I have kind of forced myself to get into it, and I was totally taken aback at the just sheer volume of social media mobilisation that's going on. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. And this social media mobilisation has had impact, which I'm going to tell you a bit about. The two groups, EU citizens in the UK and British citizens in the EU, have kind of joined forces in some ways. But actually the EU citizens have kind of had more impact than the British in the EU, and I think that this is, I've put here underlying negativity towards expats. There's a whole discussion to be had about what we call these people. A lot of them very specifically call themselves expats. Some groups in Spain are now very specifically calling themselves immigrants. In one of my surveys, I asked people how they identify themselves. There's about 5 or 6 different terms. So there's a whole discussion about that. The media only seems to like the word expats. I've written a few blogs where I've deliberately avoided using expats, and I've been told that actually if I don't use expats, they're not going to publish it. This is what the media really wants to, it thinks that that's what people understand. But there is a feeling in this country that, and government policy shows that, there's a sort of, well, you've jumped ship, so you don't count as much as people who are here. So in the whole debate, because I'm actually working on voting rights, there's a whole kind of sense in which residence trumps citizenship. That, you know, living here is more important than citizenship. I can go into that more if anyone wants later on. So one of the other reasons why the EU citizens in the UK might have got a better sort of hearing, in a sense, is that they're more numerous. And I apologise, I've taken this from the Daily Telegraph, but they do have some very good visuals. And this just kind of shows you the yellow are the EU citizens and the blue are the UK. So you can see that there's a kind of the imbalance between the countries. So there's about 3 million plus EU citizens in the UK, and probably about 1 million or so in the British in the EU. I'll come back onto the data in a minute, but what I'm going to do is look at 3 different groups. So asking the question, how are these British people in the EU experiencing the uncertainty of Brexit, and what are the implications for their citizenship? I'm going to look at 3 different sources. The first one is just social media activity. The second one is drawing some data from some online surveys that I've been doing, essentially about voting rights based on electoral registers of overseas voters, and a pilot study I've done in Brighton and Hove. And then my third source is telephone interviews with British citizens elected as local councillors in France. That was part of one of my other projects, and I revisited the people who I interviewed in 2008 to see whether their views on citizenship had changed in a sort of post-Brexit situation. So just to sort of start off with a bit of data, when I first gave a presentation on my European citizenship participation work in 2013 for an organisation called New Europeans, which many of you probably know about. At that time, we were thinking there were about 2.5 million each way. It was kind of roughly, and that kind of at that time, and then when the referendum idea came to the fore, everyone realised that we didn't really know. These statistics were terribly vague. So people have been doing some more work on it. Now the IPPR published a couple of reports, Brits Abroad and Global Brit. I think their data has been now pretty much superseded, and I think it wasn't particularly robust in the first place. But they came up with the figure of about 1.8 British citizens in other EU member states, 2.2 if you included part-timers. Then the UN did some more research, which they published in 2015, and they came up with 1.2 UK born, which isn't the same as citizenship. You get different results depending on which way you look at it. And then the most recent data is from the ONS. They produced some work in January this year, which is looking more like 900,000. So we've come right down. You know, the figures are far more sort of conservative than we imagined. And in the government white paper, they used pretty much the IPPR data of about 2 million. And I wonder whether they weren't trying to, at that point, emphasise how risky it was, and now we're realising that there weren't that many. So the ONS data comes up with, we know that Spain is the largest, about 300,000, France 157, and so on. So that's the data that the ONS has produced. But they also say that if you look at the same data by country of birth, you get 1.14. So you do get these differences, and according to how you look at it. About 20% are over 65. There is this, in this expat stereotype, a lot of people think that British expats are all retirees. That's not true at all, but there are about 20%, and they live in these countries. There's about 400,000 state pensioners, according to Migration Watch. So that's just some data to start with. And this, again, I'm afraid it's the Daily Telegraph, but they are quite good at visualising things, so that just gives you a kind of visual interpretation of that data. And then this is, again, this is the ONS data. I can give anyone links to any of this if you want to know. So my first source then is mobilisation through social media. And as I say, it took me a long time to actually go through all the different organisations who've now kind of popped up since July last year. And I've just put up there a list of the kind of most important ones. Most of them have got websites as well as Facebook pages. And you can see that the membership is really quite significant there. You know, we're talking, Remain in Spain has been one of the sort of most vocal groups. 4,300 members. Remain in France Together, Rift, over 5,000. These have been kind of important players in the social media world. There are coalitions also have grown up between the EU citizens in the UK and British citizens in the EU, because they've realised that if they get together, they'll have more impact. So the three main coalitions that have built up are the British in Europe, Brexit Communication Board, and Expat Citizens' Rights in the EU. So they're not in significant numbers, really, and they've got they haven't been around for even a year yet. So, and if we look at some of the things they've been doing and some of their achievements, one of the things that is very impressive about them is they've managed to harness lots of professional skills from their members. So they've got some amazing websites. They're not all clunky little amateurish things. Some of them are very, very impressive indeed. So they managed to be invited through their kind of social media activity. They were invited to submit evidence to the parliamentary committees on Brexit that were taking place in January. They published an alternative white paper to the government paper on the 1st of February, setting out what they thought was a fairer deal for EU citizens, both in the UK and in the rest of Europe. They sent a video called A Concerted Plea, which, if anyone, you can find it on YouTube. It's an incredibly well done video, I think, so do go and have a look at it. They sent it to all MPs before the vote on triggering Article 50, trying to persuade them not to vote. They also then were very active in the Lords Amendment, which of course didn't finally get through the Commons, but they were nevertheless very active in kind of harnessing support there. And this is where the coalition idea was important, because the Brits in the EU were persuaded that they had to buy into the idea of pushing a unilateral approach rather than a reciprocal approach. The government has always said it will only do a reciprocal deal, because if it makes a unilateral commitment to EU citizens in the UK, what will happen to the Brits in the EU? So there was a bit of arguing about this, and some of the movements, some of the British in EU movements had reservations about whether or not this was wise, but in the end they did all make a sort of joint statement of support in favour of this unilateral attempt, which hasn't got anywhere anyway. But nevertheless, they did manage, the coalitions, to meet with Michel Barnier on Tuesday this week. It wasn't widely reported in the press, but they did, and there are a few reports on it. And he agreed to that the fate of European citizens, it wasn't anything to do with wasn't their fault, and that he was going to make a deal a priority in the negotiation process. And he said that what he was aiming for was an early agreement in principle, and then they would work on the details, because there are lots of details about pension transfers, healthcare and things like that. It's actually quite a complicated series of issues that need to be dealt with. He's hoping that details will be published by 2018. So we're going to have to wait quite a long time, even if an agreement in principle is arrived at fairly early on in the negotiations. So yes, David Davis on the radio saying, yes, we have a moral duty, and we want to get a reciprocal deal. So it seems to me that this is quite impressive when you think that the EU has not been renowned for listening to European citizens very much. It's been pretty much an elite-driven process. But, okay, 5 minutes. So their main concerns. This is the results from a survey by one of the groups, the eCrew. So healthcare, pensions, travel rights, home ownership. Lots of people are thinking, will we still be able to own our property, or will they tax us more after Brexit? Exchange rates, voting rights, that's one of the things I'm working on. So those are the kind of issues that they're most concerned with. And this is another survey run by Brussels and Europe Liberal Democrats, where they had kind of similar issues. Probably in both of those surveys there's a disproportionate representation of retirees, and this suggests to me that actually it's the retirees who are the most anxious because they've got the most to lose. Pensions and healthcare are the two issues that are most troubling for them. So my second source was my surveys on Brighton and Hove overseas electors. This particular section with 324 respondents, of which 168 live in the EU, and of those 144 have only British citizenship, and of those 61% said they were considering taking out the citizenship of their country of residence. So you've got the data there for the breakdown by which country they live in. Clearly there are issues for people in Spain because citizenship rules in Spain make it more difficult. For France there's a certain cost and bureaucracy involved, so that there are all sorts of issues about how easy that is. Most British people seem to be taking quite a pragmatic approach to the question of citizenship, but my next sort of source shows that some people have personal difficulties with that. This is just 3 quotations that I took from the survey, which kind of underline the key areas of concern. So this is the second one is about voting. Many British people in the EU, anyone who was there has been there for more than 15 years, didn't even have a right to vote in the referendum, and that's a big problem for them. And then this is here, somebody talking about Spain and the difficulty of taking Spanish. You'd have to renounce your dual. So my final source is the British councillors in France. This group is of particular interest because as councillors, they've actually sort of taken up their voting rights, their right to vote and stand as a candidate. They've become elected, and my data shows that there are currently 830 British councillors elected in France. So I've got a huge database, and I thought I haven't got time to explore that. So what I did for this was I went back to the people I'd interviewed, 50 people I interviewed in 2001, to find out how they sort of evolved since then. What I found in 2001 was that European citizenship was something that they kind of hardly knew about at all, and even citizenship. When I said, well, what about your citizenship? They kind of didn't really know what citizenship meant. They said, well, do you mean like being a good citizen, you know, stopping at traffic lights and things like that? They didn't really understand citizenship, and it really made me understand that British people, when I looked into the history of it, we don't have a clear sense of what citizenship is, and that's partly to do with our history and things like that. So the people who I was talking to there were partly kind of what I call individual movers. So there were people who had individual circumstances. They'd gone there to do a degree, they'd married and that sort of thing. Then there was what I call the Peter Mayle wave. This is the first wave of lifestyle migration to France. There are people who moved post-89, Peter Mayle's A Year in Provence. These are reasonably kind of middle-class, well-heeled people. The Nigel Lawson budget, you know, that meant people had cash to go and buy homes in France and things like that. Educated, willing to learn French, keen to learn French, etc. My second wave is what I call the Ryanair generation. I think post-2001 you get a completely different sort of migration. But the ones I'm talking to here are the ones who've been there a long time. The mix of retirees and working people, their children are now becoming adults, so they've got questions of should they study in France, should they go back to the UK, all sorts of things like this. But what I found in talking to these people again was that European citizenship still wasn't kind of on their radar. The longer they've been there, the less concerned they are. So the people who were most concerned were the people who had moved as retirees, have never worked in France, and they were the most concerned. But most people have worked there, and therefore feel that they are kind of well embedded in the French system of social security, health benefits, and so they weren't particularly concerned. They were kind of pragmatic about taking French citizenship, mostly worried about the bureaucracy, because you have to get things like your grandparents' wedding certificate, and it has to be translated officially, and there's a cost and all that sort of stuff. So the bureaucracy was a problem for them. And once you've got your dossier submitted, it's 18 months before you get a reply. And I suspect that will be longer now, because the list will be getting longer. So there was some personal resistance on some, so it was a very individual thing. And some people wrote some amazing stuff for me about why they couldn't possibly take on French citizenship. Even people who've been there 30 years and whose interests, financial and pragmatic, would have been to take it, they can't do that. So there's some interesting stuff there. But finally, what was the most surprising thing for me was that all these people who have used their citizenship rights to become councillors didn't even know that the fact of being a councillor, they would no longer be a councillor post-Brexit. And one woman in particular, she was married to the mayor. And I said, well, hasn't your husband sort of mentioned this? And she said, well, no, somebody joked about it once, but it wasn't something that they talked about. So European citizenship kind of not really featuring on their radar. Just a few conclusions then. The data shows that there are significant anxieties about post-Brexit situation. And those are the people who are mobilising most on social media. My councillors in their sort of embedded situations, they weren't mobilising. They didn't even know what was going on amongst all these other people. Individuals responding on in different ways. Just finally, yes, a few little quotations from mixed personal feelings. So one thing I found was that on the one hand, absence from the UK sometimes makes the heart grow fonder. So some people were saying, the longer I'm here, the more I yearn for the UK. And other people were saying, well, actually, the more I'm here, the less I think about the UK. And then there was, the older I get, the more English I feel, one person said to me. And then one guy, this is actually somebody in Spain, but who's was talking about voting rights. I've had it with my country, because so cheesed off, let's say, with the government. So out of sight, out of mind, I'm going to forget it. I'm going to, wipe out my past as a British person. A couple of people said they thought it was insulting to have to take citizenship of the country that they lived in. So all sorts of very mixed answers, and I'm hoping that somebody will help me kind of put it all together into a kind of rational whole at the end. So thank you, and I'm sorry for that.